Yes, it's true, shooting in low light is not one of the great strengths of a GoPro. But today I'm going to show you how you can still get good footage with a GoPro in low light conditions, such as indoors or in the evening. As you can imagine, this requires us to take a very close look at the settings of the GoPro. So I open the settings menu and create a new preset for shots in low light. This way I only have to make the changes to the settings once. Then I can just activate the low light preset when needed. To create a new preset, tap on the icon in the upper right corner of the presets menu. If this menu does not exist on your GoPro, I am using a GoPro HERO 10 today, but if you have another GoPro, this is not a problem, because most of what I will say today can be applied to most other models of a GoPro. To create a new preset, tap on the plus in the upper right corner and select video. We are not changing the settings for the moment. I'll just call my preset custom. There would also be the designation indoor. Interestingly enough, low light does not exist. By tapping the pencil here on the right, we can now edit our new preset. The first setting for resolution and frame rate is especially important. As you may know, the GoPro HERO 10 allows you to shoot at a maximum resolution of 5.3K. On the HERO 9 the maximum is 5K. Normally, you'll get the best possible image quality with your GoPro at this resolution. However, that's not true in low light conditions. That has to do with the way a GoPro reduces image noise in low light, and that's apparently done by downsampling to 4K. So in low light, you should use a resolution of 4K. The results are significantly better than in 5K. The right frame rate is also of great importance. A high frame rate usually leads to particularly smooth and natural looking shots. However, a lot of frames per second have to be captured. There is therefore little time to expose the individual frame. The camera can only capture very little light for the individual frame. For this reason, high frame rates in low light are a big disadvantage. I would therefore recommend a frame rate of 24. For all those living in the PAL region, that would be 25 frames per second. The other settings here in the upper section don't matter for now. We'll look at the stabilization in a moment. Now we need to talk about exposure settings. To get the best possible results in low light, we should set exposure completely manually. This can be done using the ProTune settings. You should know that the brightness of a shot, that is the exposure, basically depends on three factors: the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO. The aperture is the size of the opening inside your lens through which light passes. On a GoPro, the aperture cannot be changed, so this value is not important for us today. The shutter speed determines the duration of the exposure time, that is how long the light can fall on the sensor. We can control this value on the GoPro. In low light conditions, the shutter speed should be as slow as possible to capture as much light as possible. The last factor is the ISO value. This value determines how sensitively the camera reacts to light. The higher the ISO value, the brighter the image, because the camera reacts more sensitively to the incident light. Unfortunately, if the ISO value is too high, image noise and artifacts are generated. The image becomes brighter, but the image quality decreases. By the way, these exposure basics are not only valid for a GoPro, but basically for any camera. You should also know that a GoPro has a very small sensor, which has its advantages, but is a clear disadvantage in low light. Now let's look at the ProTune settings in detail. I use a bitrate of high. Here you should know that in most cases you won't see the difference between low and high. This is also true in low light. High, however, leads to much larger files. If you want to save storage space, you can also use a bitrate of low. Very important is the shutter speed. As explained earlier, it determines the duration of the exposure and should therefore be as slow as possible. The shutter speed does not only affect the brightness of the image, but also the motion blur. A long exposure results in more motion blur. Fast movements will blur more. Basically, there is a rule in filmmaking for the optimal amount of motion blur. The shutter speed should be exactly twice as high as the frame rate. At the frame rate of 25 frames per second, the shutter speed should be 1/50th of a second. At 24 frames per second, it should be 1/48th of a second. So in low light, I manually set my shutter speed to 1/48. To get even more light, you could also set your shutter speed to the value of your frame rate, so 1/24 or 1/25. But you'll get way too much motion blur. Your shot will look very strange, especially if there is a lot of motion. So, such a low shutter speed is only useful if your shot doesn't contain much motion. For example, in a talking headshot like this one, it would hardly be noticeable. Now you should know that there is an important disadvantage when we manually set the shutter speed to 1/50th or 1/48th. Due to the resulting motion blur, which in theory would actually be optimal, the electronic stabilization of your GoPro can no longer work as efficiently. The electronic image stabilization needs very sharp images in order to work well. For this reason, unsightly stutters could occur despite the hyper-smooth stabilization. Therefore, it would be optimal if you use the camera on a tripod. If you want to use your GoPro frequently in low light and also want to move around, I would even recommend a gimbal. This also has another advantage. If you use a gimbal, you can deactivate the stabilization and get an even wider field of view. As always, I've put some links in the video description for you in case you're interested in what tripods or gimbals I use. Now let's take a look at the remaining settings. Exposure value compensation is not available because we set the shutter speed manually. I leave the white balance on the GoPro mostly on auto. The automatic of the GoPro usually works very well. However, a manual white balance would have quite some advantages. On very long shots, the automatic could change the white balance for no clear reason, which could ruin your shot. Also, the artificial light may be difficult for the camera to interpret, which can then lead to strange skin tones. The correct value for white balance in low light depends on the color temperature of your light source. The ISO value is especially important for shooting in low light. As mentioned earlier, a higher ISO value leads to a brighter image, but also to more image noise. Therefore, the goal should be to set the ISO as low as possible. Since we have to set the shutter speed manually, we can now use the ISO value to change the brightness of the image. For this, I set the ISO minimum to 100 and then change the brightness of the image by setting ISO maximum. And generally, you should remember, up to an ISO value of 400, the image quality is good. Above 800, you can notice image noise. Although GoPro has managed to improve the image quality at higher ISO values with the HERO 10, 800 is therefore quite usable. From 1600, a strong image noise can already be seen. 3200 can actually no longer be used. So I adjust the exposure on low light through ISO maximum. To do this faster, I create a shortcut for ISO maximum, so I always have quick access to the ISO value in this preset. I actually always set the sharpness to low. A high sharpness does not lead to more details. Rather, the edges are artificially sharpened by the camera. This may look good at first glance, but it is not cinematic and does not look professional. You can add some sharpness in post if the image looks too soft for you, or you can use medium if you don't want to edit your shot. As color, I use natural. I'm not a big fan of the flat color profile. The compression causes details to be lost in areas with little contrast. Vibrant leads to the typical GoPro colors. Especially in low light, I don't think it's that interesting. With this, we have optimally set up our GoPro. Now I would like to give you a few simple tips for shooting in low light. When shooting indoors, use the available light as best as possible. That means if it is still bright outside, place your subject near the window and use the natural light as a light source. This usually gives better results than the artificial light in the room. Also, keep in mind that a low light shot can also look like a low light shot. So you can expose your shot a bit darker. It's normal for a night shot to look very dark overall. And of course, you can bring additional light sources yourself. This RGB light here, for example, is not expensive and can easily be taken anywhere. Especially for indoor shots, you should also pay attention to a high dynamic range. If it's relatively dark in the room, but there is still daylight outside, your windows might burn out completely when they're in the frame. Such a shot won't look good. Avoid such a situation if possible or adjust your exposure accordingly. Always if that makes sense. So let's summarize the most important things. Use a low frame rate, for example 24 or 25 frames per second. Manually set the shutter speed to twice the frame rate, that is to 1/48 of a second when shooting at 24 frames per second. Adjust exposure using ISO maximum, whereby the image quality will drop sharply, especially above 1600. Don't forget that the stabilization won't work as well in low light. And that's it for today. If the video was helpful for you, give me a like as feedback. There will be more GoPro tutorials to come. So stay tuned and see you next time.